Director of the Open Estonian Foundation. I am very, very glad to open another event in the series of our Voices of Russia discussions we have been running since 2010. Over the past years, hybrid has been the word to characterize a number of phenomena. May it be hybrid war, hybrid threats, hybrid identities, and so on. Our discussion will be also a bit hybrid today, combining the voices of Russia and voices of Ukraine. So today we are happy to welcome Anna Arutjunyan, with whom we met here already a year ago, when discussing and interpreting the latest public opinion polls in Russia with sociologist Alexei Levinson. In December 2017, Anna joined the International Crisis Group as a senior analyst. Her focus now has shifted into analyzing Russia's relationship with Ukraine and its intentions in the eastern part of Ukraine. Our second guest, Ilya Ponomaryov, has also a special relationship with Ukraine. He was the only member of the Russian State Duma to vote against Russia's annexation of Crimea during 2014, Russian invasion of Ukraine. Instead of Moscow, he can now call Kiev his hometown. The discussion will be moderated by journalist, author, music critic Artemy Troitsky, whom we are proud to call Estonian resident already for the past 4 years. Before we continue to the discussion, let me pay a very special compliment to Lennart Meri Conference, our good and well-appreciated partner in organizing this event. What makes this conference absolutely special is its unique atmosphere, which opens up and inspires people, sparking new ideas and making contacts among people. I hope this discussion today, our discussion, will be an excellent kickoff for the conference that officially starts in a few hours. And last but not least, our heartwarm thanks go to the main organizer of this conference, Riina Kaljurand from the ICDS. We wish you, Riina, very happy birthday on this very, very special day. And now I would like to thank you cordially for coming to our event today here in the European House, and give a floor to Anna, Ilya, and Artemy. Thank you. Enjoy.
So, Raida Malhellam, first of all, would like to say aitäh all Eesti kallis sõbrad for great weather that we have here for already a whole month. I mean, my suntan is, it's not from the Canary Islands, it's from Kalamaja. and that's fantastic. And I wish the weather stays the same for as long as possible. Now, well, we are happy to have two very distinctive Russian voices here, Anna and Ilya. And both are experts in the Ukrainian matters. Anna, because she is focusing on Russian-Ukrainian relations in her studies at the Crisis Group. Ilya, because he is now a resident of the city of Kiev. And of course, he knows the situation from the inside. Before we start to talk about war and peace, serious fundamental issues, I would like to start off with a huge scandal that's happening in the past couple of days, and which has really put into great amusement the whole world mass media. First of all, the mass media, because of course a person from mass media is heavily involved in this accident. But that may also have some repercussions on Russian-Ukrainian and Ukrainian-Russian relations. And of course, I'm talking about the infamous case of the mysteriously killed and then miraculously resurrected Arkady Babchenko. So far, this story was developing like a pendulum. Of course, in the beginning, there were the reports, the governmental reports from the Ukrainian police that Arkady Babchenko, Russian journalist, has been killed on the threshold of his home. And of course, well, everyone understood that it has something to do with the Russian special services. Then the next day, it was announced that no, he is alive and well, and he participated in the press conference, and all this was a covered special operation brilliantly held by the Ukrainian SBU, which is, well, like the Ukrainian equivalent of KGB or FSB, well, their security service.
But better.
And actually, could be, but I'm not sure that the people are very different. Because they all have been raised in the old Soviet Union, so anyway. And then, of course, everyone was absolutely happy, and the pendulum went, you know, from sorrow to happiness. Then the journalistic community started to have some doubts. Is it ethical? Is it really okay to use dirty tricks even for a good purpose? We are blaming fake news, but this was fake news, and the whole world has been duped by that. So the pendulum again went from a pure joy to condemning of this whole operation. Now the latest news is that they've caught the guy who supposedly organized the contract killing, Mr. Boris German. And Boris German started to give evidence and named some mysterious Russian people, Mr. Pivovarnik and some others, who have ordered and transferred money to commit this crime. So the pendulum again started to move towards that it's good. So a very contradictory situation. Ilya knows a lot about it, much more than we all. So I would like you to flash some light on what's really happened.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very important thing because there are a lot of discussions about this, and to my mind, there is absolutely nothing contradictory about it. You know, it's public perception, yes, because we are living in the hybrid war, so the opposite side is actually trying to make the situation contradictory and trying to put all these like ethical questions and whatever, but there are none. The situation is extremely simple. It was a month and something ago when SBU, through its agents, received an information, received a tip that somebody is approaching former members of volunteer squadrons that was fighting in the eastern Ukraine on Ukrainian side, offering them money to commit assassinations of several of Russian opposition figures. By the way, not only in Ukraine, but some of them are living outside Ukraine. But, you know, the guys from that community. And as you understand, the community is different. There are a lot of different people there. And some of those guys are very poor. Some of those guys actually came to fight for their country, but from a criminal environment. There are not so many of them, but there are such people. And so they were talking about this. And when SBU received the list of names, and they say that there are as many as 30 names on the list, by the way, myself included, and there was a name of Arkady Babchenko on that list. And what they have done is they identified the person who agreed to be the killer, and they captured him and converted him into their agent. He agreed to cooperate in return for his freedom. And then they approached Arkady and said, so there was a procured job against you, there would be an assassination attempt against you, but if you would play together with us, we can actually quote the guy who was doing the procurement, so the FSB representative in Ukraine. And that's exactly what they have done. So this killer, who was already working for SBU, agreed to do the job. There was a hidden camera which captured the moment how the guy from FSB transferred the money.
Sorry, the guy from FSB is this
German.
Boris German.
German, yes. And why it was
a local businessman.
Yeah, why it was him, because he is the private manufacturer of weapons, and these volunteer squadrons, they were buying a lot from them, so that's why he got extensive network of his contacts in that particular community. And that's why it was easy for him to talk to them, in private, and in a trusted fashion. So SBU wanted to monitor the situation from the beginning to the very end, because they wanted to disclose all the contacts of the guy, intercept all his communications, so to have 100% evidence that the order was coming from Moscow, and identify the sources of this order, and later to present it to international allies of Ukraine, which was very important, because right now we heard about the Skripal's case and other assassination attempts in other countries. So to disclose how it usually happens was very important. So to do that, they pretended that the killer actually implemented the job. For some reason, by the way, they wanted to do it in the day of Championship League finals in Kiev, but didn't manage to do it, so it happened 2 days later. But they wanted to do it in that day. Probably SBU didn't want, even in the pretentious mode, to somehow disrupt and provoke panic during the day. So that's why it happened 2 days later. But they needed to make sure that the guy who paid the money is 100% certain that it happened. So, and after he came to pay the rest of the agreed sum, they actually captured him. So I think it's a brilliant success of SBU. To my mind, it's actually the first case in Soviet and post-Soviet history when they managed to identify the whole chain and have a 100% hardcore evidence that it was Russian official security forces behind this, so it's not a private initiative or whatever. And that's, by the way, what this German guy is right now to play in the court, because the evidence is so strong. So now he's saying that it was not FSB, it's, it's some, this Pivovarnik, it's like private guys, but the truth is that SBU has all the line of communications captured.
Okay, well, what you've told us sounds very logical. And I really hope that this is so, although still the case is, it's not completely clear.
Of course, Babchenko is a hero,
yeah.
And I personally feel, because again, it's a personal issue for me, it's a personal issue for my security, it's an issue of security of my friends. During last 4 years, as many as 8 guys whom I knew well were assassinated in different places. And so to my mind, Arkady, whom I was not agreeing with during last 2 years, almost with everything that he wrote on Russia, he still was my good personal friend, but what he wrote I thought was not right. But nevertheless, right now he's a true hero.
And he did excellent job. Okay. One little additional questions. What do you think about the statement of Boris German, who's claiming now, it's news from today, that he is also an SBU agent? So it looks like this whole story is...
No, look, it's a defense...
It's lying, simply.
It's a defense strategy, yes. So the guy is a FSB agent, and an important one. He was, again, private manufacturer of weapons in Ukraine, so he was part of national security layout. He was an implanted agent, and he was unfortunately not the lone one. There are many of people like that in Ukraine. It's very heavily infiltrated, and SBU is very heavily infiltrated. That's why they had to play this operation in a very covert mode, because they sometimes cannot trust their own people inside SBU.
And now I have a question for Anna. So, Mr. German, the alleged mastermind behind the assassination, has said that he's got money from Vladimir Putin's private foundation aimed at organizing terror acts in the Ukraine. And he also named a certain Mr. Vyacheslav Pivovarnik, a little-known person, but who apparently used to live in the Ukraine, is shareholder in several Ukrainian companies, right now is supposedly living in St. Petersburg, but he's not an FSB general, or he's not really a governmental person.
Well, we don't know his rank, right?
Yes, well, we simply still don't know who they are and whether this is true or not, and so on. So what do you think? Is there really FSB or GRU or whoever behind this plot to kill Russian oppositioners in the Ukraine and other countries, or this is like it sometimes happens now in Russia, or this is the художественная самодеятельность, the self-activity of various nationalistic, semi-fascist groups like, the Cossacks, the Union of Russian Officers, and so on, because we now have plenty of quite a scary organizations like that who may or may not obey to the FSB and other governmental structures.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, simply put, the answer to the question of whether I think the FSB or the GRU is behind this is, I don't know. I don't think any of us really do. We don't have the data, and this is actually a pattern in the last couple of years where we just don't have that knowledge. We don't have the evidence. We don't have any evidence we have is questioned 1 billion times by Russia, by Ukraine, by anybody. We're in this, we're in the age of disinformation. We're in the age of fake news. We do not have the facts. I don't know. In the sense of, based on what I've seen in Ukraine, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, does it rely heavily on enthusiasts? Absolutely. In fact, it has relied very heavily on enthusiastic volunteers in the beginning of the operation, later on. Does that mean that it does not have officials operating in Ukraine? No, it does have officials. But a lot of the time, the Kremlin has shown a heavy reliance on volunteers and people who do this out of their own initiative, hoping perhaps that the Kremlin will reward them for it. So in terms of Babchenko, I feel it's just too soon to say. I don't really want to say either or what this was. I think Ilya knows a lot more, clearly more than any of us do on this, and I'm looking forward to hearing more information as the situation develops. So for this specific case, I just don't know. What it says generally about the pattern of journalists being killed, or thank God in this case not killed, but attempts to kill them, is that what has clearly happened is over the years, over the decade, the Kremlin has fostered a climate where this kind of stuff is acceptable simply by either not being willing to or not being able to bring to justice the murders of former assassinations. This sends a very powerful signal to the same enthusiasts that it relies upon that this kind of stuff is not only going to go unpunished, but it's probably going to be rewarded. And, in the past, I used to make I felt that there was an important distinction between whether the Kremlin ordered something, and I felt it was important to not overplay that we can't really say, for instance, with Nemtsov or with Politkovskaya, it's not that Putin said, do this, no. This happens for a number of complicated reasons. Right now, my initial impression when I heard the news about Babchenko's death, and before I learned that it was staged. My emotional reaction is it does not matter anymore. It's not, in many ways, the fact that the Kremlin cannot prevent these things from happening is just as bad as if it was, as if it had done this on its own.
Okay, Anna.
But again, yeah, we'll probably get back to this.
From the staged murder of Arkady Babchenko, let's go to mass killings in Donbass. So, for me personally, I tell you absolutely honestly, I still do not understand why is this war happening. I don't know why Russia invaded Donbass, because I see no clear profits from this war to Russian Federation. I personally thought that they're simply stupid. They're stupid and blood-hungry, and that they're just maniacs, basically. Because rationally speaking, who would need a war with a neighbor state? Probably it could be okay if they taken Kiev and made Ukraine a satellite state, a marionette of Russia, and so on. But what they've done, it's like sitting between two chairs. They haven't been logical enough to finish this victorious war, but instead they are now wallowing, in some swamp of blood and global condemning. So, first of all, why this war happened, and second, of course, is there a way out of it? At least from the point of view of Russia, what is their plan of finishing the offensive in eastern Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Well, to go back a few years, I think it's important to remember that after the annexation of Crimea, which was a separate thing altogether, the Kremlin initially toyed with the idea and was enthusiastic about the idea of something similar happening in eastern Ukraine. It felt that if only we could just, stoke another popular uprising in the east, and these uprisings were already happening, and then, everybody will happily join Russia just like it was in Crimea, and it'll just be, this Russian spring and flowers and yay and bloodless, and that didn't happen that way, obviously. And when it didn't happen that way, when the Kremlin realized that it had possibly miscalculated on the kind of popular support for for Novorossiya that it could expect in eastern regions of Ukraine, it gradually abandoned the project of annexation. And yet we still have this ongoing conflict, because what it started by relying on, as I mentioned earlier, enthusiasts, not just enthusiasts, that had its own forces there as well, but to a great degree enthusiasts, was that it just assumed that, you know, things will magically happen, that it can build a strategy around. That did not occur, and yet it already had a stake in the conflict. It had given hope to thousands of fighters. It had given hope to separatists who to this day feel that they've been betrayed by the Kremlin. And it had to somehow, you know, save face and maintain its presence in these territories. Now, if we're talking about what it seeks to do, what its intentions are, we don't really know for sure. And I think this is the key problem. Russia has been very adept at denying, distorting, obscuring its objectives and its strategy, and it's very hard to discern when it does something outside of its own borders what it is it's actually trying to achieve. This makes it difficult to adequately respond to Russian actions. We run the risk of both underestimating its aggression and overestimating its aggression, and both of these things are not good if we're trying to resolve a conflict. What I've been able to, some of the strands of Russia's intents in the Ukraine that I've been able to discern based on just a lot of research and interviews is, I mean, I would name three possibilities. And this is kind of a spectrum that Russia is looking at. One is maintaining the status quo, and that's probably what we're going to see for the next indefinite amount of time. Maintaining the status quo in many ways suits Russia because you've got both sides committed to the Minsk Accords, to implementing the Minsk Accords without actually implementing them. This allows Russia to maintain a presence. This allows Russia to ensure that Ukraine does not fully enter the Western community. And it just gives it time. The second is the reintegration of Donbass into Ukraine on terms that are favorable to Russia. Now, as strange as this may seem, this is actually on the table. This is something that Russia is, that the Kremlin is willing to consider at this point because, notwithstanding the first scenario, it is a costly and unpleasant situation. The sanctions are harming Russian economy. The isolation that this is causing is also not good. So, I mean, Russia is would consider. I mean, it would be in favor of a reintegration as long as this is on Russia's terms, and that would mean special status, autonomy, federalization.
Excuse me, is this scenario which is supposed to be displayed in the Minsk agreements?
Yes, yes. So Russia is in favor of that as long as this is on its own terms. In other words, as long as this is something that Russia can claim as a win. So it's not going to be quite like what's spelled out in Minsk. It's going to be something that Russia can take home and say, look, we won. The third scenario is, in the event of escalation, Russia would recognize these territories as independent. That's one possibility that they're considering. I heard this from people with a sense of reluctance. Now, I'm not sure if that reluctance was genuine, and I'm sure that there are people who are more enthusiastic about this scenario. But again, given this spectrum, we also should add that the Kremlin is not a monolith, and we've got various factions competing for whichever outcome they feel in their heart of hearts would suit them best. So I mean, this is kind of the spectrum, and I'm speaking about Donbass. Crimea, I think, is an entirely separate issue. I don't really imagine any way that Russia would give that back. But on Donbass, I mean, the interesting thing that I managed to that I hear from people in Moscow, close to the Kremlin, is that just how many options they're willing to consider. So they really have no clearly defined red lines on this. They're bargaining. The problem is that they're bargaining in a way that doesn't give their the other side any clear ideas of what it is they're willing to do or not do. So it's as though they're kind of sitting there waiting for the other side to act and see if they can react in a way that will be beneficial to itself.
Okay, so by what you said, I understand that the only reason why the war in eastern Ukraine still goes on is because they're looking for ways to please Mr. Putin's ego.
Yes.
To make him feel that he has won, and that's it. And there is nothing else. There's there's no arguments, no military arguments, no economic arguments, no nothing. Just a stupid thing like make Putin happy.
That it's not the only thing. It is that, but there are other considerations at play. I mean, there are other factions that feel that the Kremlin made a mistake by not taking a firmer stance and by not starting with a more robust military response. There is the issue of the separatists. There are the issue of those in Moscow who support the separatists. There is the question of a lot among them who feel that Putin has betrayed them, who feel that he promised something that he did not deliver, and then he essentially allowed this mess to happen. These are not, I don't think these are trivial considerations. So it's not that everybody is just, running around Putin trying to figure out what it is he wants, although that is a big part of it. But there is also that at play.
If I may add here,
yes, please.
Firstly, I totally agree with the last thing that was said, that we shouldn't underestimate the public opinion in Russia, which was inspired by Kremlin, but nevertheless, right now it's a separately living public opinion, which in return pushes Kremlin in a certain direction, and it's a majority of population which actually is sympathetic towards Donbass, and abandoning this and just withdrawing would be considered a defeat. And as much as Crimea has driven Putin's popular support up, that fact would drive it down, and seriously drive it down, and the guy cannot afford it. And that's the first thing.
I have doubts about it. If they start a campaign on TV saying that we don't need Donbass because people die there, because we spent your pensions in Donbass and so on, so Putin, the peace lover, he wants to get out of there.
Don't underestimate Russian
people. Give me half a year of this kind of propaganda, and people will go out in the streets and say, down with Novorossiya, get out of Donbass, we want peace,
Artemy,
we want our pensions.
You're right that after half a year or a year of propaganda, you can recover the public opinion about Donbass, but you cannot recover the popular support for Putin, because it would be already lower than it was before. And people would forget about Come on. So I know that Kremlin thinks that way for sure. And,
popular support has fallen in the past.
Second thing, which is no lesser important, is the issue of Ukraine in general, because they want to control Ukraine. At the end of the day, Putin thinks that he needs a retaliation on the West. Of course, he is not thinking in the terms of Zhida Banderovцы who is controlling the country, but he still thinks that it's a pro-Western regime which came against his will. Ukraine is important economically, Ukraine is important geopolitically, Ukraine is important even religiously, because we shouldn't forget that half of members of Russian Orthodox Church live in Ukraine, half, despite that the country is three times smaller in terms of size of the population, but in terms of believers of Russian Orthodox Church is exactly half and half. And that's also an important aspect of pressure on Putin, who identifies himself as a great Caesar and a leader of the whole civilization, and the church is a part of it. So that's also a very important consideration, and I would not even mention all the other things about NATO and whatever. So I wanted also to comment on how the whole thing started. I think that it started very much unplanned from within Kremlin, I mean, unplanned. There was an internal competition between Vladislav Surkov, who was in charge of annexation of Crimea and was like coming back to Kremlin, and people who didn't want him to come back and to regain his influence, namely Sergei Ivanov and Sergei Glaziev and others. And the whole thing of Novorossiya was a counter strategy, it was a competing strategy within Kremlin, and it didn't work because there was no genuine desire from the top to make it work. They hoped that they would inspire, people to rebel, and that the people on those territories would do everything by themselves. And of course, the popular support on those territories were not sufficient. And I saw numbers that were in Kremlin at the very beginning, when level of popular support for joining Russia in Crimea was 50% plus. In Lugansk, it was 29%, if I am not mistaken. In Donetsk, it was 26%, and in all other regions of Ukraine, it was less than 12%. So then it was trailed by Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Odessa and Nikolaev. So it just simply didn't work that well, but not because Russia wanted but did not manage to, but because nobody actually was seriously putting resources behind it. And when Surkov managed to sustain his position and saying, so look guys, you screwed up, as I was saying from the very beginning that you're going to screw up, then they started this strategy of taking out all the insurgents like Strelkov and others from that territory, physically eliminating all the passionate elements like Mozgovoy, like then Motorola, Givi, and others, to make this situation just as a proxy war. But right now they hold this region as a hostage, and they want to use this region as a matter of influence in the Ukrainian politics, which I'm correctly saying.
Okay, Ilya, and what was the almighty Mr. Putin, what he was doing then? Was he sleeping or what? I mean, you're talking about Surkov versus Ivanov, Glaziev versus God knows who.
Putin is a balancer.
But this is a serious case. It's a case of peace and war and billions of dollars and human lives. Well, of course, they don't really give a shit about human lives, but still. So what was Putin doing then?
Putin took a very active role and sustained his personal position against the will of his surrounding in the question of annexation of Crimea. That was his personal thing. It was a matter of his personal political survival. It was a matter of his personal political retaliation on Maidan revolution. So for him it was extremely important, and he sustained his position when everybody was against. Later, he returned to his usual position. His usual position is not a position of a dictator. His usual position is a position of a spider who sits in the middle of a web, and which balances the different clans of influence which he surrounded himself with. And that's exactly what he has done in Donbass case. So it was Surkov and Shoigu from one side. They got a little bit too powerful because of the successful annexation of Crimea, bloodless, easy, popularly supported. So when other people were coming to him and say, look, we are going to do the same in eastern Ukraine, he said, go ahead, because it would create a balance within this surrounding.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, now let's go to the Ukrainian side. And I would like to ask you about some news that I've also read very recently.
If you want, so Moskali would talk about Ukraine, okay?
Yeah.
As usual.
Yes, you will give your expertise on some of the Ukraine's intentions. So I've read in Независимая газета, and then I've also went on a link to an article in the Facebook of well-known Kremlin politologist Sergei Makarov. And these guys are trying to convince us that between, today is June 1st, right? That between June 3rd and June 5th, Ukrainian armed force, VSU, Вооруженные силы Украины, will invade eastern Ukraine with all its might and will solve the Donbass problem with military force. Why this is so? Because, as Mr. Markov explains, the football championship is approaching. So if Russia takes military power against Ukraine, there will be a full-scale bloody war, and say goodbye to World Cup. Of course, it will be called off. No one will come to Russia to see football games while there's, missiles flying. And then, of course, Ukraine, wins because Russia loses its biggest asset of the moment, the football World Cup. And of course, if Russia decides to preserve the World Cup, it will not respond to the Ukrainian offensive, and then, of course, Ukraine wins the war. So this is the logic of the Kremlin, and I would like to know, what do you think about that? Are we going to see a big hot war in the next several days, or not? Is this a popular theory in the Ukraine itself?
Well, that's exactly the way Kremlin thinks, and if he would be on Poroshenko's place, that's how they would do. And that just illustrates their approach towards this conflict, very sadly so. But you're absolutely right. This is the way, significant part of Russian security establishment is thinking. And because of that, they were taking seriously military measures. They were sending a lot of new military equipment to eastern Ukraine from the end of April. There was massive reinforcement sent there. But I don't think that they were planning an offensive. I think, they were responding, reflecting on their own paranoia, which you just expressed. And I think that actually this whole thing with Babchenko was linked to it. Why it was linked to the Championship League? Because, they needed to offset something with the Soccer Cup championship, symbolically in the PR in the PR fashion. And so that's why they were recruiting people from these Ukrainian nationalist circles, because the message that they wanted to sell is that Ukrainian nationalists actually killing Russian, even Russian opposition. They're creating a provocation, you know, so that's how they would play it in this hybrid campaign in case Kyiv would actually start an offensive in eastern Ukraine, which I, of course, don't think would happen.
So you think that this is a wholly Russian invention, and in the Ukraine, such scenario wasn't even considered?
This whole thing is Russian invention. This whole war is Russian invention, unfortunately, from the beginning to the end.
Okay, Anna, now I would like to ask you about what you told us what are the possible scenarios considered in the Kremlin. My question is, what is more likely? And there apparently is another scenario, the violence scenario. I mean, a full-scale war against the Ukraine. Do you think that this could ever happen?
Well, I hope not. We all do. I don't really think that the Kremlin is just sitting there and dreaming about an excuse to like go in there and start a full-scale war and occupy these territories full stop. That's not the case. I don't think it wants a full-scale war. I mean, there is a serious consideration about the repercussions of its actions, what's happened as a result, the isolation that it's facing. I mean, the Kremlin is looking for ways to start kind of reconciling. It just needs to do that on its own terms. It needs to be able to present a win. It's not going to come in there. It doesn't want to go in there with tanks rolling because, I mean, if it does, it could win, but it's just at what cost? That is going to be a major war. It does not want that. Yeah, is right. Putin reverts back to this. You know, he tends to be instinctively more cautious. The Crimea decision was kind of almost an exception to the rule, an exception to his character. He tends to be far more risk averse and far more indecisive. So that's not like something that Russia wants. Problem is, if there is such an offensive on the Ukrainian side, and I don't want to talk about this particular one that Markov has said that's not really, but that I mean, my sources tell me that there is in Kiev there is a wing that wants that. That would not be. That would not be very nice, I think, for all of us who are concerned, because the Kremlin will find itself in a position where it's forced to react, and it's forced to do something that it doesn't really want to do, and that is really the worst way you want to deal with a potentially aggressive state, is corner it into doing something aggressive that it does not want to do. So the first issues, I feel that's unlikely. In the event of an escalation, as I said, there is what might kick in is the third possibility, that is the recognition of these of the statelets, going back to the Abkhazia South Ossetia scenario. Again, not something that is the very top is too enthusiastic about. There are lobbyists for this issue, but at the very top, it's not something that's that they're just itching to do. I mean, I would lean to the first two variants: either the status quo and maintaining this, you know, hot peace, or freezing the conflict, or some form of reintegration where the Kremlin can, quite frankly, get this off their hands. Find a clean way to say, okay, that's it. we've won, we can get out now. Because, I mean, what that will do is allow the Kremlin to start negotiating about the lifting of sanctions and start kind of rebuilding ties with Europe, which we saw some overtures in the last couple of meetings, given that the U.S. withdrawal from the Iran deal actually presented an opportunity for the Kremlin to say, hey, the U.S. doesn't want to be friends with you. Well, we're here in the meeting with Merkel and Macron. I mean, generally speaking, I think that we do need to consider that that the Kremlin thinks opportunistically. And if it sees a good opportunity to channel its desire to be a global power in a constructive and positive sense, it will take that.
So, Ilya, Anna says that under certain conditions, the Kremlin can sign the Minsk Treaty. The question is, do the Ukrainians want to sign the Minsk Treaty, and what is their stand in this Minsk situation?
In Minsk, what is signed, and Russia, as we know, is not a side of it, but those agreements, they were dead from the day one. They are unimplementable, to my mind, and they will never be implemented. And firstly, in general, Russia, of course, is the main beneficiary of those agreements. Putin, it's written in his favor, because the way they are written, it starts from this autonomy for those regions, and that's exactly, as Anna absolutely correctly said, is his end game. You know, that's his terms of the peace, and he wants to keep those regions with the officials elected under his control, so that he would influence the Ukrainian politics and would drive it in the direction it wants it to. And of course, that's totally unacceptable for Ukrainians. And then it starts an endless debate about the sequence of steps under Minsk agreements, and Ukraine is correctly saying that the first thing is the true ceasefire, and since it's even theoretically ceasefire cannot happen completely before the general pacification of the region, so it's an excuse to say that, you know, we are waiting for the ceasefire and we are not moving to the second stage, which is the special status of the regions, because there is no ceasefire. And that's why it's impossible to implement it. What can be implemented, and I think that's what will be implemented in the end day, is this initiative of peacekeepers in the region. And I think this is actually can be, if the cards would be played right, that is the way of this face-saving solution for Putin. Because he already publicly said that that's our initiative. In reality, it's the initiative of Mr. Poroshenko, but who cares? He says, our initiative. We introduced this resolution to UN Security Council. Okay, good. So the only debate which is important there is whether if even Russia says, okay, so the peacemakers would be on the whole territory of this territory, will they carry the functions of the management of this territory, whether they would be not just the police function, but also like an interim government, essentially, of this territory, or, you know, the officials would be still elected in the open process. And I think that at all costs, the elections on this territory should be avoided. Because in the situation of a military conflict, you will not get the objective results of the elections. All pro-Ukrainian part of the population left. Out of 4 million people which live in the region, at least 1.5 million right now are displaced persons in other parts of Ukraine. They will not return just to participate in the elections. Then you would...
But maybe they can vote in Kiev, in Lviv.
You would never agree because you will never be able to control the results of the elections properly.
I think it's a technical question.
It's not a technical. It would be a principal question because the whole thing about elections is about legalization of the current authorities on those territories. So in the free and open elections, there would be one result. In the elections that they want to carry, it would be the same. Zakharchenko elected as a Ukrainian governor of Donbass. And
why are you so sure about that? I don't think that Zakharchenko is hugely popular in Donbass because life there is miserable. Everyone knows that Zakharchenko and his allies are bandits. And
you live too long in
there's
Estonia.
A normal electoral...
You forgot how elections are happening in our part of the world.
No.
Really?
No. If there will be a fair electoral campaign under the supervision and management of the, say, UN forces and so on, and the people from Ukraine could come to Donbass and promote their parties, their programs, and so on. I don't know why wouldn't they stand strong against Zakharchenko and other bandits?
Look, Artemy, you know, I remember the debate with, I don't know whether it was Bolton at that time. So it was a U.S. special rep in the Middle East. When the United States lobbied and successfully pushed through for elections in the Palestine autonomy. It was like 2004, 2005. And we had a round table on this. And I stood and said, so if you would run free elections there, you would receive Hamas government. Said, no, it would be free elections, we are controlling the situation, it would be moderates who would be elected, led by Fatah and Abbas and whatever. I said, I can make a bet here for a bottle of good whiskey that you will get Hamas and that would result in a civil war in the region and possibly with the dismembering of Palestine autonomy. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, it's a good example, but still, I don't think that the situation is similar because in Palestine, most of the voters are young people, are aggressive young people. In Donbass, most of the voters are old women, pensioners.
Who are voting as they have been told from the top.
Who are tired of war, who are tired of what's going on, and who definitely want a normal, quiet life, which would not be possible with the kind of people like Zakharchenko. I think that psychologically, the masses are tuned into different ways.
They voted for this war in the first place in 2014, and I was the observer on that referendum. So.
Well, but then they didn't know what will really happen. Well, still, I think that elections is not a completely lost cause.
Let's not experiment. It's enough. These people really need peace, and it will not make any difference if you run the elections. After 5 years, when you restore the region, the jobs would be restored, the industry would start working, the taxes will start flowing. It would be peace, and then you run free elections, and then, whoever wins, wins. But if you do it in the situation of military conflict, unfinished military conflict, you would never get fair results of the elections.
Okay, so you think that the cornerstone of the situation is the elections? Yes. I personally thought, not being an expert at all, that the main thing there is who controls the border, the Russian-Ukrainian border. And can you tell me, under the agreements that they may come to, like if we forget about the elections, then what is the consensus, if it exists, regarding the control of the border?
No, of course, if we are talking about peacekeepers on the whole of the region, it automatically means the control of the border. And it really doesn't matter whether the control of the border is being carried by Ukrainian border guards or these peacekeepers. At the end of the day, the result is the same. The issue is that it has to be controlled by somebody, but not Russia. You know, and that's exactly what is being discussed. But I totally agree with what Anya has said, that Putin wants to give up this territory. He doesn't want to carry on with this stuff. So, but they want to sustain their position in Ukraine in general. And I think what is actually would be happening during the coming year is there would be no changes in eastern Ukraine. You know, if Surkov would be replaced, especially with Babic, it would be disaster. Of course, that would mean disruption of whatever talks are between Volker and Surkov that they carried right now. But they would focus on the elections in Ukraine, and they would try to disrupt the elections in Ukraine. They would try to disrupt election campaigns of all like genuinely pro-Ukrainian candidates, so that it would be a candidate that is okay with them as a president, and then the political forces also, there are no like genuinely pro-Russian forces, but acceptable for Russia political forces in Verkhovная Rada, because presidential elections are in March next year, and parliamentary elections are in October next year. So I don't believe that until the October they would actually do any kind of radical changes in the East.
I see. Anna, would you like to add something to what Ilyas just said?
About the peacekeeping talks. This is a very interesting situation, actually, because I think that from Russia's perspective, a decision on this could be a really positive step forward. Interestingly, the Volker-Surkov talks have kind of stalled because of I guess a difference in perspective, and I don't even mean this in the diplomatic sense. I actually mean that both sides are seeing just the situation from a different prism. Russia is open to a number of variants here. It's open to a phased plan. It is even a possibility that it would allow peacekeepers to control the border. However, what it really needs is to be able to come home and say, this was our proposal, this was our resolution, so we are waiting on you, the American side, to provide us amendments to our proposal. Mm-hmm. And the way it is right now is that the American side is like, they're thinking that they came up with their own proposal, gave it to Russia, and now they're waiting for Russia to respond to it, and Russia's saying, we've got our proposal.
Oh, but
you
Volker
gave us...
said it's okay if it is a Russian resolution.
But they want...
They even pushed Ukrainians to withdraw their own resolution from UN, so that it would be a Russian resolution.
Yeah, but the Russians, they want amendments. They want it formulated in a way that's, you know, our original. So whatever it is that you want, you bring it to us as, you know, specific little, you know, edits to our text. So that, I mean, I see this in a, strange as it may seem, I'm usually a pessimist. I see this in an optimistic light. This is an opportunity, as long as you said, Babic doesn't come along. I mean, I don't know if it's somebody else, but if Surkov is replaced by somebody else, it could also mean that actually the talks would move forward, just as long as it's not some kind of really, you know, incendiary, patriotic, like red lines, no discussion type of thing. So if that were to happen, that could actually be a first step in something. We don't know what. But towards the next step in the Minsk process.
Thank you. We have 25 minutes left until the end of the session, and I think it's exactly the time when we can answer your questions. Yes, please.
You both argued that the project Novorossiya is abandoned, that Russia is seeking the way out of it. Well, are you absolutely sure that it's finished and off and over? Or it just put on hold and it can be renewed in any possible moment, today, tomorrow, whenever.
Look, the whole idea of Novorossiya was created in the editorial board of Gazeta Zavtra in the beginning of 90s, which was also as much anti-government as anti-government could be. They were part of the events of 1993. You know, this whole team of people, you know, Dugin, Glaziev, Strelkov, Borodai, I know them for ages. They were part of the Communist Party establishment, this Gazeta Zavtra, you know, these type of things. And they were always anti-Kremlin. Kremlin, just for a short period of time when they needed them, you know, took this concept and said, okay, so that's a kind of interesting story, even if it was not, by the way, officially supported at the level of Vladimir Putin. You know, it was not said, it was never said so, but it was in the media, you know, because they wanted something, you know, they wanted. But Putin in general is as ideophobic a person can be. He's a truly conservative guy, you know, wants to be pragmatic and whatever. That's why they use this as a certain temporary, you know, ideological construct to justify the actions. But since it didn't work, okay, so it would be other.
I just want to add to that. I mean, there is no such long-term plan. The thing that I think we need to remember, in light of everything that happened with Ukraine, is that the Kremlin is not intrinsically bent on world domination. That's not what's happening. That's not what was happening. That's not what it wants. It wants to be a global power. It wants to be a держава, but that is not the same thing as world domination. It does not mean it wants to take back restore the Soviet Union. It is an opportunistic government that acts based on stuff that happens, and if it sees that it would be beneficial to it in the short term, it acts. That's not the same thing as harboring long-term plans to take back these territories. Are there factions within Russia that favor this kind of scenarios? Yes. Will they come to power? We don't know. We hope they won't. But that's not the current Kremlin administration, and I don't expect to see that in the near future.
Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for your insightful discussions and for sharing your viewpoints. My question touches upon the Babchenko case and the potential response to it. It's the second time in 2018 that we have had a case of Russia trying to kill its citizens in other countries, as we had with the Skripals in the UK. And the response to this was quite strong from the West and its allies, where there were officials and delegates sent out from their countries and so on. I think in many ways we have to take this Babchenko's case on the same bar, because it was an assassination attempt, more or less. And we have to be really careful with the signals that we send out if we don't do anything, the West and Ukraine's allies, because Putin will see that once again he can do whatever he wants and he can get away whatever he wants in what he does in Ukraine. And second of all, that West doesn't really care or do anything in Ukraine unless it gets too messy, so to speak. So my question is, do you think something should be taken as a response towards Russia, or something will be taken? Yeah. Thank you.
Firstly, it was not more or less an assassination attempt, it was an assassination attempt. Secondly, of course, action should be taken. Whether it will be taken, you know, I have certain doubts. But of course, I would do my personal best to ensure that something would actually happen. But even in Skripal case, we actually see how it's happening. Because when another friend of mine, Alexander Litvinenko, was murdered back in, what was it, 2012, I believe, yes? No, earlier than that. It was even longer as the time flies. So, yeah, so, yeah. The current Prime Minister of Great Britain was the person who did her best to block the investigation of Alexander Litvinenko case. She personally has done everything because they needed good relations with Russia, and if it's not efforts of Marina Litvinenko and Alexander Goldfarb, who was helping her in this, this case would never be properly investigated. Right now, politically, the situation in Great Britain is different, and that's why when it's happened, you know, it was at full alert. But look at the reaction of other NATO members and in Western countries. British said that they are going to consult NATO about invoking of Article 5 in regards to using weapons of mass destruction on their territory. By the way, again, exactly the same as it was in Litvinenko case. And so far in history, it was only one example when Article 5 was actually invoked. It was after September 11 in the United States. That was the only example. And when British started to say so, they were getting negative responses that it would not be supported by other NATO members. And they, as a compromise action, they decided to expel Russian diplomats from different embassies in the Western countries. How, you know, expulsion of Russian diplomats were linked to that particular case? There was no linkage. You know, it was just because it was a compensation for British, so to that we express the solidarity, but we don't go into what can be a military type style response to this. Here in Ukraine, we are facing a full-fledged war where every day somebody dies, every single bloody day. And still the response on behalf of the West is absolutely inadequate. Germans are building Nord Stream 2. Macron is coming to St. Petersburg Economic Forum and even being asked, you know, straight in the face about the Malaysia airplane. He said, oh, I now just heard the positive signal from Vladimir that he's going to pay attention and participate in the investigation. So, like, what a joke it is. So whether the action would be taken, you know, unfortunately, I have doubts.
May I add a couple of words? I think that the strength of the reaction largely depends on whether really strong and convincing evidence of the FSB involvement in it will be displayed or not. If the whole world will be sure that yes, there is a plan to kill 30 people in the Kremlin, well, by the Kremlin in different countries, then I think you know, it sounds really scary, and I think that some kind of measures can be taken. And as far as I know, in the Ukraine, President Poroshenko has already announced that they will give security guards to all the people on the list.
Yeah, it was announced, but again, Ukraine is Ukraine, and you know, obviously in Ukraine the reaction would be strong. But those guys, they are not carrying their military IDs with them. So what kind of evidence can be provided? You know, it's basically what can be provided and what would be provided is words of SBU. So, and then it's up to you. If you want to believe in it, you know, you will believe in it. If you don't want to believe in it, you will not. And already all the Russian sympathizers in the world were mobilized to criticize Arkady for unethical behavior as a journalist. You know, and that's the whole thing. It's an outrageous, it's outrageous absolutely People, exactly the same people who were criticizing Babchenko when he was alive and he was writing things that he wrote in his Facebook, the exactly same set of people were the first to write, you know, we lost such a great guy and we will participate in the funerals, and the next day when it appeared that he is alive, again they started, so what a bastard that he is alive.
So my question is to Mr. Ponomarev. Could you please tell us about the power in Russia? How much of the power does the Russian parliament, the Gosduma, have as opposed to the Kremlin? That's my question. Is there any competition whatsoever?
No. The answer is very simple. No, there is no power. The power is only in one place in Russia, and all the checks and balances, which do exist in this system as well, but they are not institutionalized in any kind of official bodies, and that's the great danger, because it's a characteristic of Bonapartist type government regime that we currently have, which is linked to one person. And as I'm saying, he's not a dictator, but he is an institution, not because he's a president, but because he's Putin. And it doesn't matter, you know, whether he's called the president or the prime minister or Tsar or a pensioner, you know, he is still Putin, and all the power is linked to him personally. And as soon as he dies, you know, when it would happen inevitably, as we understand. He is mortal, you know, sooner or later, I hope sooner than later, but, you know, when it happens, the whole system is defunct.
Blue shirt.
Thank you. My name is Yu Li. I'm a political scientist. I have a question to the panelists about the concept of saving the face. This is what I very often find in a Western press and research papers, that the West should offer the Kremlin to save the face. How do you think Kremlin perceives this concept? Is it valuable for them as well as the same value as for the West, or is it really
punch them in the guts, not in the face? That's
I think it is very important for the Kremlin because a lot of its activity abroad currently is actually about optics. It's actually about making it look like Russia is a world player who is meddling in everybody's affairs and everybody's afraid of it, whereas it's actually not. Doesn't necessarily have the capability or the will to do more. In that sense, this is again both a risk and an opportunity. Should the West be offering ways that Russia can save face? Well, that depends on what the West wants to do. And again, the West is too broad a concept. I think we're talking about several states that are part of the West, and it really depends at this point on what it is that each country dealing with Russia wants to see happen. I mean, I think in that sense there does need to be a more realistic approach, in the sense of like recognizing Russia's premium on this kind of on these kind of optics, not in the sense to say that Russia is right or that it gets a free pass, or by no means in any case of appeasement, but on a purely practical issue to see how it can get Russia to stop doing bad things. That's not the West's responsibility, but I'm sure that Western countries are just as interested in this as actually, yeah, but we are all interested in this. So is there a difference about how the Kremlin perceives saving face? Of course, but I think it's important to look at its past actions in order to predict how it will respond to future sanctions.
I wanted to add to this that, as Vladimir Lenin used to say, there are compromises and there are compromises. And usually people who are supporting this idea of saving face, Putin verstehers, they basically say, oh, we should be just pragmatic, it's all about trade, money, and, We just forget about what is happening in terms of values and the human rights and the aggression and whatever. We should just act rationally. But still, there has to be principles. And one thing is saving face by allowing Kremlin to introduce their own resolution in the United Nations on the peacekeepers, if in this resolution it would be written what is agreed together and what is actually needed. And the other save of face is constructing of Nord Stream 2. This is like two different things. Or forgetting about the annexation of Crimea and what is happening there with Crimean Tatars, or closing your eyes on the situation in eastern Ukraine. So it has to be principles at the end of the day, and it's our, again, joint mission to ensure that these principles are upheld.
More questions? Yes, please.
Thank you.
Ladies
This has been
very
very illuminating. I'm Kristi Raik, Director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at ICDS. I think what has not been mentioned is that Russia is maintaining readiness and capability for quick military escalation. It has its forces in the proximity of the Donbass, and it also controls the military forces in Donbass. So, as you said, the Kremlin is not really keen to start a full-scale war. But still, the fact that the readiness is there, it kind of begs the question, why? And what could be the scenario where these forces and this escalation readiness would actually be mobilized? Thanks.
Because it wants to show that it can. Doesn't necessarily mean that it will, but it wants to show that it can.
Basically, I 100% agree. I think it's, in general, for any country, it's normal to have its military in operational mode, and for post-Soviet Russia, for many years, it was a great problem. By the way, it's even now the military might of Russia is sometimes over-exaggerated in the West for very understandable reasons. Some people want to have more budget allocations for themselves, in fighting preparations. But of course, Russia also is trying to play its cards right, and Putin is a master of bluff. He's a good poker player. There are not so many capable military regiments in Russian military. They have done a major campaign on military modernization and replacing outdated equipment, but I can tell you as a member of Russian parliament who was regularly reviewing the progress was not encouraging at all. And I remember the conversation with Shoigu when he was already Minister of Defense, when he was saying that 80% of the equipment, of the new equipment which is coming to military, is unoperational and has to be repaired from the day one. And that's a result of Serdyukov's reforms in military industrial production. Yes, amount of money, if you look at the budget which was spent into modernization, is substantial and, sometimes I would say breathtaking to the Russian standards. But how much of this funding was actually stolen on the way? Probably 90%. So it was extremely inefficient. And the offensive, whether Russia can organize another offensive in Donbass, most likely on this, in this local area, most likely it can. But at what cost? Cost would be tremendous. And currently, Ukrainian military are already capable of efficiently counteracting with any kind of military offensive. For Baltic states, the situation can be different because here military potential is very low. But I don't think that in any case Kremlin, even in the current state of mind, would actually organize any like true military campaigns. Some security provocations, I think especially Lithuania is very much vulnerable to this because there is a railroad which connects Kaliningrad with the rest of the country, which is coming through Lithuanian territory. But like frontal tanks operations, no, I don't believe that would ever happen.
More questions, please? Yes.
Mikhail Matveev, one remark and one question. Remark is that the war in Ukraine, I'm quite sure, was a quite necessary thing that was designed by Putin to demonstrate, first of all, to Russians that any attempt to overthrow the dictatorship will lead to bloody war. It was clearly, and to demonstrate to other countries in Russian sphere of influence that attempts to join EU or leave simply this sphere of influence will be punished. But in this situation, the position of EU looks very strange because after, for example, after the start of this war, the export of natural gas from Russia increased twice in Germany. It was not even frozen on the same level, but it was increased. And the question is, where is the red line, and does it exist, which Putin is not allowed to cross?
I totally agree with everything that you said. Exports grew not twice, but they grew very significantly. It's actually, for last year, it was more than it was in the Soviet Union. It was all the time record high result of exports of Russian natural gas to Europe. So the energy dependence has not decreased but increased over the last 3-4 years, despite all the statements of European Commission and whatever. And of course, it's, you know, that's an illustration what the real policy is of European Union. And this is very worrying, and I think it's not in the interest of European Union, and it's not in the interest of Russia. And it actually sends a very strong message to Russian elites that, yes, we are not serious. And that's how they take it. And right now, only Americans, you know, this beloved Trump, great Putin's buddy, he is acting actually properly, you know, because he needs to clean himself from all the Russia's links. So what Americans are doing, they are doing the right thing. And the recent sanctions on Deripaska and Vekselberg probably was the best thing that actually happened since 2014 in terms of demonstration of the resolve. And that sent very strong message to many people back home, and after that, even in Great Britain, it was started before Skripal's case. Actually, for the first time during the last 2 decades, Russians are selling more of real estate than buying real estate in London.
The last question, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My last question is related to how to make peace between Russia and Ukraine, because it seems to me that together, only together, 2 of them, they cannot. There is a face-saving for both sides. Third party is needed. And my question is, which third party do you prefer to solve this conflict, to make a peace? Or is this France? Sarkozy played a very important role in making these Minsk agreements. Now you said that he's weak, he doesn't want to do that. Is this Merkel, or is this Trump, or what is your suggestions? Who can make this peace? Who can help to make this peace?
I wish it was that easy. I mean, there's several variants that need to be looked at. There's no prescription here. I think that in terms of a third party that's going to, I mean, I would see this in Europe. I mean, possibly the kind of somebody who's already got a good relationship with Putin, such as Merkel. The kind of things that could lead to a peace, aside from the mechanisms that we already have, which is the Minsk Accords, which is not really happening, as we've all said. It's not enough. We can't really scrap this agreement because it's really the only instrument we've got. But we could definitely use with some additional channels between Moscow and Kiev, and between Kiev and Donetsk. The way that these channels would happen, again, this is somehow this would need to be very nuanced, possibly back channel, possibly unpublic, and I think that Europe would be in a place to support this kind of mediation to make sure that, again, no red lines are crossed.
Firstly, I don't believe that any of Western European states can be the mediator, because they have vested interest in Russia. They don't have any interest in Ukraine, neither economic nor political interest. And it's, their involvement in all this Minsk and, Normandy formats, whatever, it's just face-saving thing. They are not genuine, and they were never been genuine from the very beginning, unfortunately. There is more vested interest in this situation in Baltic states or in Poland, but they are taken in Russia as very hostile. And that's why, it's hard to be a mediator when one side is like genuinely doesn't believe in your integrity here. In general, if we are talking about mediators, you asked this question was unexpected for me. I was starting to think I can name two countries that can be such a mediator potentially, because they have good relations with both countries and good personal relations on the presidential level and whatever. This is Turkey and Israel. But I don't think that they would be very much willing to engage, but technically they can. But in general, I think that the resolution of this conflict would actually happen from within. At the end of the day, we are close relatives, Russians and Ukrainians. I think we can do it ourselves if international community would be consistent, at least to the degree of currently Americans are demonstrating this consistency in pressuring for the resolution. I think we will be able to do it.
Okay, well, I'm afraid it's over. It's over. Thank you very much, Anna, Ilya.
Thank you.
My dear audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would you like to have a word?
Thank you again for coming, for speaking at our
Thank you.
event. Thank you, Artemi, for moderating. I would like to call you to another event tomorrow, 3 o'clock. They are globally going on Oleg Sentsov support campaigns, and we will arrange tomorrow at 3 o'clock in Kino Sopros a free screening of about Oleg Sentsov. Film is documentary is called Process. So please come and join and so express your support to Oleg Sentsov.
It's a great movie. I saw it. It's a great movie.